Hello, and thank you so much for joining me for a new book. I'm so excited about this. This book is called The Final Curtsey by Margaret Rhodes, and I've been reading it over the past week, and I've got to say I've been enjoying it as much as the Stephen Barry books. It's just an absolute delight, and it's given me so much insight into Queen Elizabeth II because Margaret Rhodes was her cousin. The Queen Mother's younger sister was her mum. So the Queen Mother was her auntie. And of course, Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret were actually her cousins. And so they grew up together. They had a lot of fun during their childhood. And right through her whole life, Margaret Rhodes with her husband used to go up to Balmoral every single year and spend quite a few weeks there. And the Queen just loved spending time with her. They would go riding together. They just got on so well. And about 22 years before the Queen Mother died, they were going riding one day, and the Queen knew that Margaret was having some trouble because her husband was very, very ill. And they had their own beautiful home, but it was sort of out a bit. And so the Queen said, if you can stand living in suburbia, she said, would you like to come and live at Garden House in Great Windsor Park? And Margaret Rhodes absolutely just jumped at it because it would be such a help because, of course, they would be near medical facilities and they would get more help and she would have the company of the royal family, her relatives. And so she just jumped at it. And throughout those years, she became a lady of the bedchamber for the Queen Mum. Now, she adored the Queen Mum. She was her favourite auntie and she just absolutely loved being with her and being her companion and being of help to her. So it's all good. It's just a lovely, lovely story, but there's so many good insights. So let's get on. I've picked out a few key moments. I'm kicking off with the death of the Queen Mother because that is right at the start of the book. And then I'm going to take you into some childhood memories which actually mention Marion Crawford, which is relevant to our book next year, The Two Princesses. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember, and as the years passed, she seemed immortal. She had, however, been unwell since Christmas 2001, and I suppose I'd been steeling myself for the worst. And then she goes on to say that she was away on a cruise, and during that time she was actually notified that Princess Margaret had died. She'd had her third stroke. And she noticed that when she got home that the Queen Mother had rapidly gone downhill. And she says this about that. It is unnatural for a mother to suffer the death of a child of whatever age, and it compounds the grief. Margaret, the Queen, and I had grown up together, and when young, Margaret had such great promise, beauty, intelligence, and huge charm. It seemed a life unfulfilled in so many ways. In childhood and when she was growing up, she was very indulged, especially by her father. If she did misbehave, she invariably diffused the situation by making everyone laugh, so the misdemeanour was forgotten, if not forgiven. It was hard to resist her, but she did have the most awful bad luck with men. However, the Almighty usually gets the right people to be born first. Now, isn't that incredibly telling? Because there's so many sort of echoes of Andrew, echoes of Harry there. The fact that very indulged and an unfulfilled life. And if they made a mistake, they diffuse the situation by being charming and making people laugh. That's Andrew, that's Harry, that's Margaret. So it seems to be pretty much how spares go down, doesn't it? And, you know, full of charm, awful bad luck with men. I guess you could say about Andrew and you could say about Harry, awful bad luck with women. And, you know, isn't it interesting, that poignant last line? However, the Almighty usually gets the right people to be born first, which is, of course, King Charles, and of course, William, and of course, Queen Elizabeth II. Since 1991, I'd been a woman of the bedchamber to my aunt, a mix of lady-in-waiting and companion, and in her final weeks, I went to Royal Lodge every day, usually around 11 or 12, and had lunch with her, the meal being set on a card table in the drawing room. I tried to amuse her with snippets of news that might interest her. It was difficult to get her to eat much. About all she could usually manage was a cup of soup, although her chef, her page, and I spent a lot of time trying to think of dishes that might tempt her. So she had a genuine love for the Queen Mother. This wasn't an obligation thing. She really had genuine love. Now, she got a call quite suddenly, and so she went up to the house and she noticed that the Queen's car was there. This is Queen Elizabeth II. I went straight to my aunt's bedroom and found her sitting in an armchair. The Queen was beside her wearing riding clothes. She'd been alerted while riding in Great Windsor Park, her groom always carrying a radio link to the castle. My aunt's eyes were shut, and thereafter she did not open them or speak another word. The doctors came and went, but the nurse, the dresser, and I stayed without. After a while, I was persuaded to take a break and went for a walk in the garden. When I came back, she'd been put to bed. She looked so peaceful. At her bedside was the Queen, accompanied by Princess Margaret's children, David Linley and Sarah Chatto. John Overton also came back, and we all stood around the bed while he said a prayer. And she actually died on the 30th of March, which is actually my birthday. She looked lovely and almost younger. Death had wiped the lines away. I knelt by her bed and said a prayer for her. Then I stood up and gave my final curtsy. Hence the name of the book, The Final Curtsey. Okay, so I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit now, because in the next chapter she tells a lot of childhood memories which are really quite lovely. And she goes into the Second World War and the fact that Elizabeth and Margaret were sent away to the country for their own safety. And she was actually sent away to keep them company, to be their companion. So she was sent away from her mum and dad and her home as well. Although she does say throughout this book that her mum particularly was pretty disengaged. She wasn't really into children. They were put off to the nanny a lot of the time in her household. Princess Elizabeth's governess was Marion Crawford. So this is relevant to what we're interested in later. She was introduced to the Duke and Duchess of York by another of my aunts, Lady Rose Leveson Gower. She was very nice, really, but then she wrote that sugary book about the childhood of Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, which so upset Queen Elizabeth. Now, of course, that's quite controversial because people are of the opinion that Queen Elizabeth did actually set up Crawford to write the book or to write articles for women's magazines. And then when it became apparent that this was a way for Crawford to actually become independently, able to earn a living, and she wanted to go off and marry her beau, that's when the Queen Elizabeth sort of started to put a kibosh on it, because she felt like she was losing Crawford. Also, it's also been said by a lot of people that she was actually very jealous of Crawford's relationship with Elizabeth, particularly after she met Prince Philip, and she was having that first flush of courtship and romance. She was incredibly close to marrying Crawford. And, this could have been a way for the Queen Mother to drive a wedge in between the two of them, because she was very jealous. But this is all, speculation. There's a lot of things that seem to back it up, because she was this steel sort of person within a velvet glove. But I guess we'll never really know. And certainly when you hear Margaret Rhodes' version of the Queen Mother, you doubt all those sort of horrible stories, because she loved her so much and she says so many nice things about her. Anyway, back to the book. I will let her speak. Which so upset Queen Elizabeth, who could not even begin to contemplate that anyone could commit such a breach of trust. Looking back over the years, it was pretty innocent stuff, but in those days, different standards applied. I haven't read it, and I don't think I shall. Now, Margaret Rhodes actually had permission to write this book, and really, Marion Crawford didn't write anything as intimate as Margaret Rhodes wrote. I think the sticking point is she didn't get permission, whereas Margaret Rhodes did. And I don't think they granted sort of servants permission as readily as they would their close and trusted family. Princess Elizabeth and I were really the last generation of girls from families like ours who didn't go to school, who had governesses and nannies and things like that. But she did have dancing lessons. And it was at the dancing school in Edinburgh that day the abdication of King Edward VIII was announced. To my eternal shame, I hopped around the room chanting, "My Uncle Bertie's going to be king! My Uncle Bertie's going to be king!" which of course was Queen Elizabeth II and Margaret's father, Bertie. Very soon afterwards, Uncle Bertie became Sir and Princess Elizabeth became the heiress presumptive. So, yes, their relationship changed from that point because, of course, Queen Elizabeth II was then going to ascend to the throne. Sorry, Princess Elizabeth, she wasn't Queen Elizabeth II yet, was going to ascend to the throne. And the Queen Mother, who was just Auntie Elizabeth, became the Queen Mother, or the Queen Elizabeth, and Uncle Bertie became Sir. Much has been written and said about the so-called bad blood between Queen Elizabeth and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, but not once in all the years I was with my aunt, not once did I ever hear her say anything remotely unpleasant about them. So that's, sort of very contrary to what a lot of other people have said, isn't it? Many years later, when the Windsor's house in Paris was restored after the death of the Duchess, a collection of Christmas cards from Queen Elizabeth was discovered, each of them inscribed affectionately, giving the lie to the popular view that my aunt bore a deep-rooted grudge towards the Duke and Duchess for precipitating her husband into the sovereignty. And that was what is always claimed, that she was so angry that Bertie was under so much pressure during the Second World War and she blamed the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and she could never forgive them. And here's Margaret Rhodes saying, well, actually, no. She used to send them, private Christmas cards every year and she never said a bad word about them. But maybe she never said a bad word about them because Margaret Rhodes was her young niece. And, maybe she wouldn't be so indiscreet. Now, here's a little snippet about Birk Hall. Now, obviously, Margaret Rhodes is actually in Scotland all the time. And she says lovely things, like I said, about Balmoral and also Broadlands. And this is her love of Birk Hall. Birk Hall is a very special place, and the greatest fun of the whole year was my annual childhood visit to join Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. The garden descended steeply into the river, and sometimes we would picnic on an island in the river. Princess Elizabeth, just 10 months younger than me, was a natural playmate. We endlessly cavorted as horses, which was her idea. We galloped around and round. We were horses of every kind. Cart horses, race horses and circus horses. We spent a lot of time as circus horses, and it was obligatory to neigh. Another game was called Catching Happy Days. This involved catching the leaves falling from the trees. Isn't that gorgeous? Isn't that lovely? Catching happy days, catching the leaves as they fall from the trees. Such a romantic, innocent time, such a lovely, lovely childhood. And she said they were always outside, like it was frowned on to stay inside. And to this day, even as a grown, sort of rather elderly woman, she feels guilty if she stays inside too long. There was a gramophone and just one record, either Land of Hope and Glory or Jerusalem. I can't remember which, but we played it all the time. Princess Margaret used to keep me awake at night as I was given the next door bedroom. The walls were very thin and Margaret would sing Old MacDonald Had a Farm, which went on and on with a refrain of animal noises. It was an incessant chant, and I prayed that she would exhaust herself and fall asleep. Well, of course, Margaret made a habit of doing that at Balmoral when she was, well past middle age. She used to keep all the staff up and all the guests up singing quite drunkenly at the piano. Now, I'm not suggesting that she was drunk when she was a young girl singing Old MacDonald Had a Farm, but it seems like she was sort of heading that way, heading the way to sort of be a little bit annoying and inconsiderate to the feelings of others. And the final little snippet I'll share out of this book was when she was 17 and she was going to secretarial college, and she enjoyed her usual visits to Balmoral. But have a listen to this, because she's 17 now, so she's sort of starting to be considered a grown-up. By then I was 17 and considered to be sufficiently grown up to be allowed down to dinner. One night I witnessed the royal family experiencing the personal tragedy of war. We were sitting there when in the middle of the dinner one of the pages came in and whispered in the ear of His Majesty's Assistant Private Secretary, Sir Eric Melville. Sir Eric got up and quietly left the room. Minutes later he returned and whispered to the King, and then the King left. There was silence around the dining room table. Conversation was impossible. We sat silently, imagining all the possible disasters that could have happened. At length it became impossible to stay there, and with a feeling of relief, the Queen stood up and signalled for us to leave the room. She then hurried to join the King, while we all sat in the drawing room, still shocked into silence. At long last the King and the Queen returned, and the King told us that his brother, Prince George, Duke of Kent, who was an RAF Air Commodore, had been killed in a flying accident when his plane crashed into a mountain in northern Scotland. The weather had been vile that day, a low mist, rain and east wind, the worst flying weather. That evening the King and Queen left for London, and 7 days later, after the funeral, the King returned to Scotland and made a pilgrimage to the scene of the tragedy. There were happier times though. Despite the war, the King and Queen Elizabeth, particularly the Queen, was absolutely wonderful at making life fun for their daughters and their guests. Now, when she says Queen Elizabeth, she's talking about the Queen Mother, just so you don't get confused. There was a game called Kick the Tin, customarily played after tea. All the visitors, however grand, had to take part. It involved a great deal of running and climbing in and out of windows and generally caused mayhem. I remember watching Sir Samuel Hoare, the Lord Privy Seal, being made to run like the devil and becoming very hot and bothered and confused. I try and imagine a similar holder of a high office doing the same thing nowadays, but I can't. But Queen Elizabeth was very persuasive. And I believe she was. There's all those funny stories about Margaret Thatcher actually visiting Balmoral with Queen Elizabeth II. And the whole family was very persuasive about these after-dinner games, and you just had to play them. And I could imagine they would have been so much fun. But I also imagine that it would be a little intimidating if you didn't know the game. Can you imagine? You'd be the only one that wasn't good at it, and they'd all get frustrated and impatient with you. So that's a little snippet from the #1 bestseller, The Final Curtsey, a royal memoir by the Queen's cousin, Margaret Rhodes. And Margaret Rhodes actually attended Catherine and William's wedding as well. She was really quite elderly then. And she went with her son as her +1. And there's some lovely photographs throughout this book as well. So if you enjoyed Stephen Barry, I highly recommend this one. I think you'll really enjoy this. It's a gentle, lovely read. It's still available. It's not out of print. So I highly, highly recommend it. I'll be back next Friday night with another book, and I'll give you another really great snippet. I'm really enjoying this. I'll see you then. Bye.